In this extraordinary cabinet meeting, he said Somalis, quote, come from hell. They complain and they do nothing but bitch. Take a listen.
These are people that do nothing but complain. They complain. And from where they came from, they got nothing. We don't want them in our country. Let them go back to where they came from and fix it.
A response to this was necessary. It did not arrive with sirens or breaking news banners. It arrived as a single sentence, spoken calmly by a Somali minister, and somehow it froze Washington in place. Trump should focus on American voters, not Somalia. Most people scrolled past it, but inside that sentence was a confession the empire never meant to hear, a mirror the West never wanted to face, and a warning Africa had been preparing to deliver for decades. Why did that quiet remark unsettle U.S. diplomats more than protests, sanctions, or military threats ever could? What was hiding behind Trump's sudden obsession with Somalia in the middle of a collapsing American campaign? Let's find out. Somalia did not enter American politics because Washington suddenly cared about the Horn of Africa. It entered because the American story itself was cracking. By the time Trump began invoking Somalia on campaign stages, the foundations beneath his message were already giving way. Inflation had eaten into paychecks, healthcare costs were spiraling, student debt was crushing an entire generation, and the promise that America was still the world's moral and economic leader felt increasingly hollow even to his own supporters. The old slogans no longer worked. The applause was thinning. So his strategists reached for the oldest emergency lever in imperial politics, redirecting anger outward. Find a foreign shadow that could carry the weight of domestic failure. And Somalia, already caricatured for decades by Western media, became the perfect vessel. At rallies, Somalia was not presented as a real place with history, people, and agency. It became a symbol, a silhouette of chaos used to frighten voters into loyalty. Trump spoke about Somali migrants not as workers, doctors, or business owners, but as a warning sign, a story of what happens when America loses control. The message was never subtle. If your life feels harder, if your job feels insecure, if your city feels unsafe, look there. Look at Africa. Look at Somalia. That is the trick every declining empire uses when it can no longer deliver prosperity. It turns the world into a mirror that reflects its own fear of its people. What made this especially dangerous was how easily the narrative landed. For decades, Western television screens had trained audiences to associate Somalia with piracy, famine, insurgency, and failure, while carefully editing out the fingerprints of Western policy that shaped that reality. The Cold War interventions, the IMF shock therapy, the proxy wars, the militarization, the abandonment, none of that survived the media cut. So when Trump pointed at Somalia, he was not inventing a villain. He was activating one that had already been manufactured for him by a long history of imperial storytelling. Behind closed doors, this was understood. Internal campaign messaging framed Somalia as a contrast frame, a way to dramatize American decline without admitting that the system itself was broken. Somalia became a stage prop, a psychological tool, not a policy concern. It allowed Trump to perform strength while avoiding the far more dangerous conversation. Why millions of Americans no longer believed in the future their government promised them. And yet, something went wrong with the script. The country that was supposed to absorb the insult did not remain silent. The symbol refused to behave like a symbol. Somalia answered back, not with rage, not with protests, but with composure. When Ahmed Mualim Fiki finally spoke, he did not defend Somalia in the language Washington expected. He did not plead for understanding or sympathy. He simply turned the lens around and said, in effect, that America should fix itself before lecturing anyone else.
We begin with US President Donald Trump's continued anti-Somalia campaign. His racist comments have sparked outrage among Somalis across the world. The latest reaction has come from the Somali Defense Minister, reacting to Trump's repeated attacks against the country. The minister said that the US president should focus on fulfilling his pledges to American voters rather than busying himself with Somalia. In his statement, the defense minister thanked the US for its military support in the fight against al-Qaeda-linked terrorists, but he rejected Trump's characterization of Somalis.
That moment shattered the entire performance. Because the power of a scapegoat only works when it accepts the role. Somalia did not, and in refusing it, the empire lost control of the story. So the real question is not why Trump talked about Somalia, but why Somalia's refusal to play along terrified Washington more than any foreign rival ever could? Because Somalia was never supposed to speak back, the West forgot to remember how it had first been written into the imperial story. Long before Trump's rallies, long before the insults and the applause lines, Somalia had already been carved into a strategic map drawn in Washington and Moscow. During the Cold War, the Horn of Africa was not seen as a home for people, but as a square on a global chessboard. Somalia's ports, coastline, and location near the Red Sea made it too valuable to be left alone. So the superpowers arrived with weapons, advisors, and promises, quietly rewiring the country's political DNA in the name of ideology. When alliances shifted, the weapons stayed. The United States armed and funded competing factions to counter Soviet influence, then abruptly withdrew when the game changed, leaving behind a militarized society with no functioning state. The collapse that followed was not spontaneous. It was engineered fragility, a vacuum created by foreign intervention and then filled with chaos. International financial institutions stepped in with reform packages that stripped Somalia of its remaining public capacity, dismantling social services and hollowing out the very institutions needed for recovery. What remained was a nation forced to survive inside a permanent crisis, while the architects of that crisis declared it a failed state. This is the forgotten map behind Trump's insults. When he described Somalia as broken, he was unknowingly describing the shadow of American policy itself. The famine images, the warlord politics, the endless humanitarian emergencies, none of these were inevitable features of Somali society. They were the downstream consequences of a global order that treated Africa as a tool rather than a partner. Yet Western media carefully removed this history from view, leaving audiences with a simplified morality tale. Africa failed itself and the West merely observed. But history does not disappear simply because it is inconvenient. Somalis carried it with them when they migrated. They carried the memory of a functioning state, of trade routes that once linked East Africa to the Middle East and Asia, of a society that survived not because of Western aid, but because of internal resilience. They carried the understanding that the chaos they were blamed for had been imported, not inherited. And this memory became the foundation for something far more dangerous to the empire than anger: self-confidence. That confidence is what made Somalia such a poor scapegoat. A truly broken nation begs for validation. Somalia did not. It rebuilt quietly, independently, and deliberately, using networks of kinship, commerce, and technology that bypassed the very institutions that had failed it. The diaspora became a living rebuttal to the Western narrative, proving that the problem was never Somali capacity, it was Western control. This is why Fici's sentence landed like a thunderclap. It carried the weight of this hidden history inside it. It said, "We know what you did, we know how you left, and we know how we survived anyway." The empire was not being accused of cruelty, it was being accused of irrelevance. And that accusation is far more destabilizing than any protest. Which brings us to the next turn in the story. If Somalia was shaped by Western intervention but rebuilt itself without Western permission, how did that transformation quietly unfold inside the heart of America itself? That transformation did not announce itself with headlines or grand ceremonies. It unfolded quietly, in places the empire no longer paid attention to. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Somali families arrived in American cities that had already been written off as economic dead zones. Minneapolis, Columbus, and parts of Seattle were struggling with empty storefronts, shrinking tax bases, and hospitals that could not find enough staff to keep their doors open. To Washington, these places were statistics. To Somalis, they were an opportunity. What followed was not charity, but reconstruction. Somali entrepreneurs pooled savings and opened logistics companies that linked Midwest warehouses to East African ports. They built healthcare clinics that served communities abandoned by corporate providers. They created fintech platforms that moved billions of dollars in remittances across borders faster than Western banks ever could, quietly funding schools, clinics, and infrastructure back home when international donors were still arguing over paperwork. None of this appeared on the evening news because it did not fit the script of African dependency. Inside American hospitals, Somali doctors and nurses filled shortages that threatened to shut entire departments down. In long-haul trucking, Somali drivers became the invisible backbone of supply chains that kept supermarket shelves stocked through crises. Somali women, often dismissed by Western narratives as victims, became financial architects, managing rotating credit associations that outperformed formal aid systems. This was not assimilation into American decline. It was parallel state building inside the empire itself. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable for Washington. The people Trump portrayed as a burden were quietly doing what the American system could no longer do for itself, solving problems with discipline, community, and long-term thinking. While U.S. politics descended into spectacle, Somalis were building institutions that worked. Their success did not depend on government grants or military protection. It depended on trust, networks, and a memory of how societies function when they are not managed by an empire. The result was a reversal no strategist had predicted. Somalia, the failed state, was exporting competence into the heart of the empire. The diaspora became a mirror that reflected American decline within itself. And that mirror is terrifying to power, because it reveals that dominance is not natural. It is maintained, and it can be outgrown. This is why Trump's rhetoric was not accidental. It was an attempt to break that mirror. By insulting Somalis, he was trying to reassert a hierarchy that was already slipping away. But hierarchy only survives when both sides agree to it. The diaspora no longer did, and neither did Mogadishu. So when Ahmed Moalem Fiki finally spoke, his sentence carried the quiet confidence of a people who no longer needed validation. It was not defiance for attention. It was a statement of fact. America's problems were not Somalia's responsibility. The empire could no longer outsource its collapse to Africa. And that brings us to the moment that changed everything. Why did one calm sentence, spoken without anger, suddenly expose the fragility of American authority to the entire world? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Because that sentence did what no speech, protest, or sanction had ever managed to do. It inverted the courtroom. For decades, Africa had stood in the dock, accused and judged by Western capitals. Its leaders were summoned to explain poverty, corruption, instability, and underdevelopment, while Washington positioned itself as the patient teacher, the moral referee, the indispensable guide. When Ahmed Moalem Fiki spoke, he quietly moved the chairs. Somalia was no longer on trial. America was.
US President Donald Trump's continued anti-Somalia campaign. His racist comments have sparked outrage among Somalis across the world. The latest reaction has come from the Somali Defense Minister, reacting to Trump's repeated attacks against the country. The minister said that the US president should focus on fulfilling his pledges to American voters rather than busying himself with Somalia.
There was no anger in his voice, and that is what made it devastating. Rage can be dismissed as emotional. Calm cannot. When he said Trump should focus on American voters, not Somalia, he was not defending immigration policy. He was indicting a system. He was pointing to a political class that could no longer solve its own problems yet felt entitled to lecture a continent that had survived far worse. In 7 words, he stripped away the myth of Western moral authority and replaced it with something infinitely more dangerous for the empire: accountability. Inside Washington, the message was understood immediately. This was not a diplomatic spat. It was a challenge to the structure of power itself. Because the empire does not fear criticism from enemies, it fears indifference from those it once controlled. Fiki was not begging for respect. He was acting as if Somalia already possessed it. That posture alone collapsed the hierarchy. What made the moment irreversible was its timing. America was not strong enough to laugh it off. Its economy was wobbling under debt, its political institutions were paralyzed by factional warfare, and its international credibility was eroding under the weight of broken promises. In that fragile state, the empire could not afford a former client state speaking as an equal. The mirror Somalia held up was too accurate, and the mirror reflected something even more unsettling, that the empire no longer knew how to fix itself. For decades, Washington had exported solutions to Africa, governance templates, security doctrines, and economic models, all while failing to repair its own social fabric. When Fiki said focus on American voters, he was exposing that contradiction. He was saying, stop pretending to be a savior when you cannot save your own people. This is why the sentence traveled so far and so fast. African diplomats did not hear an insult to America. They heard permission. Permission to stop performing gratitude. Permission to stop explaining themselves. Permission to speak as sovereign actors rather than junior partners. Somalia had done something no summit ever achieved. It normalized African confidence. And once confidence becomes normal, control evaporates. That is the true danger Washington felt. Not Somalia's words, but what they unlocked across the continent. The empire was no longer the center of the story. It was becoming just another character in it. So when Fiki spoke, he was not closing a debate. He was opening a door into a world where Africa no longer waits for Western approval. And that raises the next question that now hangs over global politics. How did this quiet moment in Somalia ignite a chain reaction that is still unfolding across the African continent? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now, because Africa was already standing on the edge of a turning point, waiting for the first voice brave enough to step forward. When Fiki spoke, he did not create the movement, he gave it language. Across the continent, leaders and societies had been quietly re-examining their relationship with the West, asking why decades of partnership had delivered debt, dependency, and perpetual insecurity instead of development. His sentence arrived like a tuning fork, resonating with frustrations that had been building for years, but lacked a unifying expression. In the Sahel, that frustration had already begun to harden into policy. Burkina Faso was dismantling the French military footprint that had promised security, but delivered instability. Mali was tearing up Western security contracts and building new alliances that did not come wrapped in lectures about values. Niger, once presented as Washington's most reliable partner, was telling U.S. forces to leave, no longer willing to host foreign troops while its own people remained poor and unsafe. These were not impulsive acts of rebellion. They were calculated decisions rooted in a new understanding. The old model no longer worked. Fiki's words did not instruct these countries on what to do. They validated what they were already doing. They said, quietly but powerfully, that Africa did not need to apologize for choosing itself. That dignity was not a favor granted by the West. It was a sovereign right. And once that idea took hold, it spread faster than any ideology ever could because it felt true. South Africa heard it and refused to bend to Washington's pressure over its foreign policy choices, insisting on an independent path that reflected African interests, not Western convenience. Kenya heard it and began openly questioning IMF prescriptions that had locked its economy into cycles of austerity and unrest. Across the continent, a generational shift was underway, led by young Africans who no longer believed the story that their future depended on Western approval. This was the chain reaction Washington did not plan for, not because it lacked intelligence, but because it misunderstood Africa. It assumed power flowed only from weapons, aid, and sanctions. It failed to see that the most disruptive force was psychological, the moment when a people stopped internalizing inferiority. Fiki's sentence became the proof that this moment had arrived. It was not loud enough to be dismissed as propaganda, and not angry enough to be framed as an insurgency. It was simply confident, and confidence is contagious. What terrified the empire was not the loss of bases or contracts, but the loss of narrative control. Once Africa stopped asking to be helped and started choosing its own path, the entire architecture of Western influence began to look obsolete. Which brings us to the final turn in the story. If Africa has stopped asking for permission, what happens to a global order built on the assumption that it always would? What happens is not a dramatic collapse with flags falling and armies retreating. It is something far more unsettling for the empire: quiet irrelevance. The old global order does not end with a bang. It ends when no one feels compelled to obey its voice anymore. This is the world that Fiki's sentence revealed. A world where Africa no longer measures itself by Western approval, where Washington's judgments no longer define success or failure, and where the center of gravity is slowly, inevitably shifting away from the Atlantic. For decades, power rested on a simple assumption: the West would set the rules, and Africa would adapt. That assumption built aid architectures, security partnerships, development frameworks, and diplomatic rituals designed to keep Africa orbiting Western interests. But once confidence replaces dependency, those structures lose their meaning. You cannot sanction dignity. You cannot embargo self-respect. You cannot drone strike a psychological awakening. This is why Trump's attempt to define Somalia as broken failed so spectacularly. Somalia did not answer with statistics or pleas. It answered with posture, with calm, with the unspoken message that Africa no longer needs to explain itself to anyone. In that moment, the empire lost the power it values most, the power to define reality. The future this opens is not one where Africa becomes anti-West for the sake of revenge. It is one where Africa becomes pro-Africa by default, where partnerships are chosen, not inherited, where security is negotiated on equal terms, not imposed, where development is built from local logic, not imported blueprints. This is why the old powers feel uneasy, because a self-confident Africa does not fit into their strategic spreadsheets. And yet, this future was always inevitable. Empires rise by controlling stories, and they fall when those stories stop working. Trump's rhetoric was an attempt to keep the old story alive: Africa as a problem, America as a solution. Fiki's sentence ended that story in one breath. America has its own problems to solve. That ending cannot be reversed. Not with sanctions, not with military bases, not with diplomatic pressure, because it lives in the minds of people who no longer feel small. So when historians look back at this moment, they will not see a spat between a Somali minister and a US president. They will see the day Africa stopped asking for permission to exist on its own terms. They will see the moment the empire realized it was no longer the center of the world, just one country among many, struggling with its own contradictions. And the final question that now hangs over global politics is not whether Africa will rise, because it already has in spirit and confidence. The real question is whether the old empire can learn to live in a world where it is no longer obeyed. Let us know in the comment section. Will Trump focus on the US more? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.